Okay, everybody. That was a good discussion. Thank you. That was fun. Lots to think about. Huh? Lots to think about, which is great. Okay, this last week we didn't have questions. We just had reading, essentially a couple pages a day for 5 days. So we're just going to kind of review that reading. And then I have a test to hand out.
You have the test.
No way.
We were looking everywhere for the mysterious test at the end of
I
chapter
answered
3.
these questions at the end of the book.
Well, okay, don't worry. I knew that would get a reaction. But
It's an open book test.
it's an open book, and I'm not collecting them back.
Oh, great. Okay, that's good.
I love those tests.
But everyone's going to have to grade themselves and announce their
We have to
grade.
be honest.
All right.
So it's fun. It's a good test. It's true, false, and just a few things. So nothing to get too worried about. Okay, I want to look at page 44 and the map. Basically, oftentimes when people study the Bible, they kind of gloss over the locations. And then what happens is you hear about the same cities and the same areas over and over and over again. And people generally tend to not stop and actually look at the map and see where it all is. And I'm guilty of that. So anyway, we're just going to look at, in general terms, the map of this time period so we can actually put everything in a historical, geographical context. Okay. Another exercise you guys can do actually is Paul's missionary trips. You can actually map those out. You can actually, a lot of Bibles have those mapped out, but it's really interesting to follow along because culturally the message changes based on location. So there's a lot of truth to be learned there. But essentially we have the Mediterranean. Okay. Down here would be the Gulf. And then you can see from the map we have 2 main rivers. The Tigris, and then the Euphrates goes roughly like that. So, Mesopotamia, boom, boom, is in between the 2 rivers. Okay. And essentially the book talks about various people groups that have lived over a large period of time, starting with the Sumerians, who invented writing, apparently. And actually, historically, Mesopotamia is just loaded with influence culturally and globally at the time. The land was actually characterized by many different people groups sweeping in, sweeping out. They had a very worldly theology, which was typically polytheistic, multiple gods, multiple deities. These deities actually reflected the life of man, which is to say, they procreated, they had families, and yet they were still deities. So in that sense, it's a very unoriginal, uncreative type of religious system, one that is basically drawn from what you observe among men, as opposed to Israel, which was monotheistic, and we'll see shortly, was highly inventive and different for the period at that time. Okay, so we have Mesopotamia. Actually, there's a longer coastline here, so let's just fix that. We'll just go down this way. This area is Syria, Palestine, Sinai, Egypt is down here, G-Y-P-E-T, okay. Egypt was actually very interesting because it was geologically isolated. It did not, what would I say, geologically? Yeah, and geographically.
I'll do both, yeah.
Very isolated, so culturally they were not influenced by a lot of marauders and oppressive governments coming in and out. In fact, Egypt has a very, very unique history, which has been a succession of dynasties and a succession of kingdoms, starting with the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. New Kingdom starting in the 18th dynasty. And there are large gaps between these kingdoms, so like Middle Kingdom to the New Kingdom, there might be a 400-year time period where the Hittites were moving around and such. But essentially Egypt stayed more isolated, and therefore their theology was one that was more consistent. They have their own creation myth, in fact, and they also had many, many, many gods. There's no clear-cut understanding of when Joseph, for instance, story of Joseph, which we'll get to actually, who the Pharaoh was. Some scholars say it was the end of the Middle Kingdom. Others say the beginning of the 18th dynasty, the New Kingdom. It's really fascinating, though, that in the 18th dynasty, early in the 18th dynasty, there was a pharaoh called Akhenaten, who was the first pharaoh, actually, to outlaw all the other gods and only had one god, and that was the Aten, which was the sun. And actually, this pharaoh instituted a revolution among the people in terms culturally, religiously, and it's really fascinating because one would question where he got these monotheistic ideas. And it was a very dangerous time period for him as pharaoh because the religious establishment who survived off of all the offerings and to all the gods and all the temples they had in Egypt, their whole system was threatened. So it's a really fascinating, fascinating history. The pyramids were actually built in the beginning of the Old Kingdom. So they predate everything. Yeah.
2 seconds aside. On my lunch break, I listened to a radio show on KBRT. It's called Southwest Radio Ministry. And the guy's like, must be about 80 or 85. He's old. He's been like Israel 43 times, and he's in World War II. He's been all around the world. He's had this radio ministry for probably 40 years. He said the only human structure that survived the flood was one of the pyramids. And have you ever heard that? Or
No, I haven't heard that.
yeah, first time I heard it too. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm thinking about something.
The flood had to have been before the pyramids.
I don't know.
That makes sense.
We'll have to talk about that. I have some thoughts going off in my head. It's interesting, though, Egypt is not the only place in the world where there are pyramids.
Right.
And similar structures are actually in South America.
Very much.
Yeah, and so that's a whole nother story. And essentially the evolution of a pyramid structure, they're typically tombs both in Egypt and in South America, and they started as step tombs, where you had steps leading in a flat, and eventually that evolved into a pyramid structure. The pyramids in Egypt today are striking in their size, but they're physically very ugly. But back when they were originally created by men, they were actually covered with polished stone, so that, I think it was limestone, and what happened was when you went and saw them, they glistened and they were white, polished, smooth surface limestone. They were beautiful and served as a beacon throughout the entire region. But then, in typical fashion, the ancient Egyptians were constantly, they had rock quarries and such, and a whole system of how they brought the rocks to and fro, great distances. But that was a very expensive and time-consuming process. So typically what they started doing, especially in the 18th dynasty when there was a lot of building, they started taking stones off of previous buildings and reappropriating them. And in fact, there are columns in not Thebes, but in one of the temples in the Valley of the Kings, right, that they found filled with hieroglyphic stone fragments that they used as filler in their columns. So it's just really fascinating. And actually, too, would rewrite their history. So if a pharaoh started losing battles, they would literally take a chisel to the hieroglyphs in the stone, scratch it all out, and rewrite history with a false account of what happened. It's just really fascinating. The Egyptian history is very fascinating. The whole point here is that they were kind of a little region unto themselves. The Syria-Palestine served primarily as a land bridge, and as such, there were a mixture of peoples in this area as well. They were subject to political changeovers, aggression, back and forth, back and forth. So they were the least isolated and the most susceptible to foreign influences. Okay, so it's just really fascinating. Okay, just as points of reference, Babylon is roughly here. Is closer to there, and Nineveh is actually up off the Tigris. And these are all cities that show up over and over and over again in Scripture. And the Assyrians actually were up here too. The Assyrians. This is just an overview of the region at the time. Egypt obviously is still there. Turkey is up here. Israel is a tiny, tiny little country right here. Next to Israel is Jordan. Iraq is largely this area. Iran is on the other side of the Gulf. These are modern distinctions now. So just to give you an idea of what was transpiring geographically at the time. Oh, and then finally, the book actually references the Sea Peoples, also known as the Philistines, who they guess came from Greece, and more than likely came from Greece, actually.
Who did? The Philistines?
The Philistines, and that gave us the word Palestine. Palestine is actually a mountain range, and it's really interesting when you look at what's going on now with the so-called Palestinians. The Palestinians were never a people. They were never a people group at all. They were just a mixture of other people groups that lived there. And now, in the last 20, 30 years, it's been used as a weapon, a PR weapon against the state of Israel, as an example. But the Palestinians were never a people. They were a mixture of other peoples that just settled there. So when you read your news articles, they never point that out. They weren't direct descendants from a specific people group, from the Assyrians or the Egyptians or anything. They were a complete mixture of settlers, basically. So there's really no such thing as a Palestinian historically. So anyway.
So what's going on, or how does this overlay with like Greece and other cultures? Are they flourishing in this time? Are they
Yeah,
alive?
actually, at some point the Bronze Age starts in Europe. So yeah, they're isolated. They're not actually partaking in this whole history. Although, you could travel across Turkey, and actually the people came across in the boats, the sea people. But there wasn't a lot of travel in the sense that there is now.
They said something happened in Greece, and that's why.
The fall of Troy.
Fall of Troy.
Yeah, but there would be other factors involved too, not just that. And actually, too, it's really interesting. The Egyptian people actually are more Asiatic historically, as opposed to African. So, which implies that way back they came from Asia and settled in that area, and then skirted across North Africa, because the North African people are physically very different from the rest of Africa. So it's obvious that they have a different lineage. So, and especially the Egyptians too. You don't really start getting into Africans as we know them until you get down to historically what's Nubia, where they had the gold mines, which is just south of Egypt. And in fact, if you were unfortunate enough to be a slave at that point and assigned to the gold mines, in Nubia, which is now Ethiopia. It was a very dire and dark life,
In what way?
living in the caves, mining gold as a slave.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just really, really amazing. But that was Nubia, which was the precursor to Ethiopia. But anyway, that's just an overview of the region. Day 2. Who can just mention some of the parallels among the creation accounts of some of these people?
Oh, yeah.
Well, one got chopped up into lots of pieces and.
Right. But no parallels to the creation account in Genesis.
Oh, here.
Just as a general overview. There's essentially 2.
Flood, there's a lot of flood.
Okay, yes.
The Adapa,
That would be, yes. one
where
of
they
the
have
parallels.
the similarity where man is tested by
Right.
eating-related issues.
Except he passed.
And he passed, and
Yeah.
and he ended up,
Right.
but it's just the parallel of eating.
Right, right.
And plus the name Adam and Adam are very closely phonetically linked.
Yes. And also a lot of these creation accounts, the deities created from a watery chaos, which is interesting. And they often, well actually they all created by fiat, which is by decree, by fiat, which is by decree, but not as in the Genesis account, which is out of nothing.
Ex nihilo, is it?
Nihilo, yes. Ex nihilo, out of nothing. Remember we talked about how God cannot lie, so if he speaks it, it becomes true. It's part of his nature.
Oh yeah, they're also parallel of Eden or paradise.
Okay. Now, day 3 and 4, was Israel a picture, a mirror, or a window? Window? I care to,
Well, it was a stark contrast to the world around them. The world around them was polytheistic, and Israel was monotheistic,
Right.
and their whole culture was built around.
right. Don't you find that really fascinating? And, even a worldly non-believer scholar would have to sit back and ask himself or herself, how could that be? When you have all these people intermingling, and the religions and the creation myths all intermingling, then you have this little sliver of land, a little piece of land, where there is an entirely different mode of thought. Right? Isn't that fascinating? So, what one thing would characterize Israel from the rest of the countries around them? Number 1,
Monotheism?
monotheism. Very good.
God is outside the pit, he's outside of the world.
Right, okay, that's number 2, belief in a transcendent God. Transcendent. And actually, that means, who can tell me what a transcendent God is?
Above.
Outside of time?
Outside.
Outside.
What's the opposite of transcendent?
Descent,
Hmm?
Continuous?
A God within.
Constant.
There was a word in our reading. Eminence. I-M-M-A-N. So that's verses
Oh, yeah.
A-N-C-E. So the difference here, for Israel's God, God was transcendent. He was outside of. All the other gods, little g, of all the other creation myths in the area, they were immanence. They were residing within creation. There were no actual rigid boundaries between that which is God and that which is material of creation. It was all a big sea of mixture.
Who made the decree, though, that they came out of the water or whatever?
According to their creation myths, it would be different gods. There was Ptah from Egypt. There were other deities.
So, but there wasn't like an eternal one that decreed stuff to happen?
According to whatever myth there was, that particular god would, yes, decree by or create by fiat. So, but the point here is that the gods, little g's, and creation were a continuum,
Yeah.
which is really interesting when you think about it, because there's also a ban on magic, which is another one of the list. Think about magic and witchcraft, actually, and there's a lot of religions based on witchcraft, magic, and such. They all adopt not a transcendent God, but the immanence of God, meaning God within creation.
So you can manipulate.
Exactly. So you have the forces of nature, the material of nature, you have mankind, witchcraft, magic, all of those types of religions that exist even today are focused on manipulating the physical world, doing ritual imitations of materials and incantations and such. And that's how they exercise their faith. But it's not a transcendent God. So this is where this all started, actually. Way, 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 way back. Ultimately, if you don't believe God is transcendent, then you reject God. Period. So ultimately, why the ban on magic for Israel? It's a rejection of God. It's a rejection of His place, where He is, who He is. It's a rejection and a manipulation of how He made His creation. Therefore, God would necessarily be opposed to that. It's the same thing in the Garden of Eden, the sin. Ultimately, the sin was, I know better, I know what's best for me as opposed to what God told me. I'm going to exercise my own self-agency, and that's the sin. Ultimately, that's a rejection of who God is. So, another one was
Non-sexual. What the origins of God.
Right, we're getting at that one. Yes, that there is there's no mention or even an attempt to describe where God came from. So whereas all the other deities, there's some type of creation story as to where they came from.
Yeah, in the beginning, God,
origin.
that was, yeah.
So, not interested in God's origin.
Origin.
In God's origin. Whereas all the other creation myths had some type of.
Yeah.
Also, that God was a non-sexual being. The deities of the time reflected what you could observe in mankind, which is marriage, relations, children. And this is among the gods, little g. And that's why I say that these creation myths were really unimaginative, because they're all drawn from what you can observe in your fellow man. Whereas the faith of the Israelites is actually truly creative, because God is so creative. It's outside of our realm of understanding and comprehension. So there is that also. There is that distinction also. So, these other points are just really fascinating to me. 6 and 7. The Israelites had an elevated sense of history, as opposed to all the other people groups back then. If you do not have a transcendent God, then you have no purpose. So these religions were not interested in any form of truth in terms of man's history. Everything was capricious. Everything was just maybe yes, maybe no, whatever the gods felt like doing that particular day. Consequently, there would be no appreciation of history. What gives us our value? What gives history its value to us? Why is history important to us? Huh? Yes. What else?
We learn from history.
Yes.
It gives us a future plan. It helps
Yes.
meet our future plan.
We understand God's purpose.
There we go. That's, yes. History is a way God, when we look back at history, we can see how God reveals his purpose for us. So again, we have a transcendent God and a concept of a God who is Lord over us and sovereign. In these other creation mythologies, man was created basically as an afterthought. In some cases, as a series of servants, so the God's little g wouldn't have to do any work. As opposed to the creation account in the book of Genesis, where man is the crowning achievement. So there's that opposite as well. So if man is the crowning achievement of creation, that necessarily says that God wants a relationship with us and has a purpose for us. And we see throughout Genesis, throughout the entire Old Testament, history unfolding, which is essentially God working through his people so that we get to know him and know of him. Whereas these other people groups had no sense of the value of history because there was no purpose to life. Everything was an afterthought. The deities were capricious in nature. You can manipulate them by incantation, by making imitations of things that occur in nature, ritual incantations. You know, it's all very capricious and without purpose.
It's interesting because the Quran actually says that Allah is a capricious God.
Right. Yeah.
Because he's not a transcendent God.
Right. He's not even.
Yeah, that's a whole other
Yeah, it is.
discussion because I could go off on that for another hour. But yeah, yeah. So that's a good point. So anyway, they devalued history, and God has an overarching plan for us. So consequently, for us, history is very important. Also, we have a sense of the future. Eschatology, study of the end times, we are looking towards the future as well. So as we talked about in the first class, time has a beginning point and end point. There's the arc of time. We are experiencing the timeline sequentially as we go through that arc. God is outside of that. He can see every point simultaneously. That's how he knew me before I was born. That's how he knows me after I'm not here on this earth.
Mm-hmm.
That's how he can call things that don't exist as though they do. Because that's our perception. We experience the timeline sequentially. But God is not limited in that sense. So he sees all points at the same time.
That's how we are already seated in the heavenlies.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So I find that actually very comforting as well. You know. So, and then we get back to the Calvinist Arminian debate, because the Calvinists would say that that's very consistent. God is sovereign. He knows every decision I'm going to make because he sees my day tomorrow and the day after. I don't see it yet. I don't know. But an Arminian will say that's not possible. I can still exercise my free will outside of God's sovereignty. So, you know, again, we're back to that debate. And finally, the Israelites actually put a lot of emphasis on the genre of narrative, historical narrative. And we're going to see a lot of that in the book of Genesis, and we're going to see a lot of that in other books throughout the Old Testament. Chronicles, Kings, actually, a lot of historical narrative. Again, historical narrative is retelling history. So again, it highlights the importance of history. But not for its own sake, but in order to discover God's revealed purpose and will in our lives. Let me remind you, there is not one letter, period, word in the entire Bible that is not there for a purpose. There's nothing extra. There's nothing that's lacking. It's perfect. God's word is perfect. So,
Tim, what was number 6?
History.
Elevated history.
Elevated appreciation of history. Elevated appreciation of history. And then the historical narrative. But all this by way of saying, you can see how that little land and that small people group, how vastly and fundamentally and profoundly were different from all the other populated people groups in the world. And really, you'd have to ask, how can that be? Well, we know how that can be, because God set that forth. But it's fascinating. So when we study the book of Genesis, remember that Israel is a window to an entirely different world view. And I said this in the first class. Even us today, our worldview affects how we live our lives and how we see other people. It's important to build that Christian worldview in a consistent and logical fashion, right? So that we can all move forward. So, anyway, we'll just finish up with Matthew 5:13 to 16. Who'd like to read that when they get there? Okay. Matthew 5:13 to 16.
You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven.
Yeah. Israel was salt and light of the earth. All right, we'll go over these tests next week. They're open book, and then they're actually fun. It's not too hard.
I have all these pages. No math? Oh, it's just one.
Very, very easy. We'll do it together on Wednesday.
Are we doing this now? Or bringing it back?
Okay, everybody, that's it.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Tim.
Get out of here.
Yeah. Get out of here.
I thought we'd leave early.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve.
See you Wednesday night.
Are you coming? Really? Seriously? Oh, awesome. Okay, great.
That was a weird sequence of comments.
Well, what's it? I'm like, what? So that just means he's coming to my mini church.
Yes.
Which either means
The dreaded,
trouble.
yeah, the dreaded pastor visit.
Gee, I hope I get fired.